My granddaughter looked at me across her kitchen island, the one I'd helped her pick out the granite for, and said, "Grandma, I think it's best if you don't come to the baby shower." Then she smiled, like she was doing me a kindness. I smiled right back and said, "Of course, sweetheart, whatever you need." Let me take you back to where this really started, because the smile cost me more than she'll ever know. I'm 68 years old. I raised my daughter alone after her father walked out when she was 6, and when my daughter got sick, really sick, the kind that doesn't let go, I raised her little girl too. That little girl is Hadley. I changed her diapers. I sat up with her through croup and ear infections and the long winter she had pneumonia. I taught her to ride a bike on the cracked sidewalk in front of our duplex in Tulsa, and when she fell and split her lip open, I'm the one who held the dish towel to her face and told her she was brave. My daughter passed when Hadley was 9. I won't go into all of it. There are some kinds of grief you carry quietly so you don't pour them onto a child. After the funeral, it was just me and Hadley in that little duplex, and I made a promise to my daughter at the graveside that I'd see her girl grown and settled and loved. I've kept a lot of promises in my life. That one I meant down to my bones, so I did what you do. I worked. I've been a school cafeteria manager for 22 years, and after I retired, I took a part-time job at a fabric store because Hadley wanted to go to a state college 2 hours away, and the financial aid didn't cover everything. I sold off my late mother's good jewelry, the cameo brooch, the little diamond studs my husband gave me before he turned into someone I didn't recognize, and I never told Hadley where that money came from. I just told her it was set aside. I wanted her to feel like the world had been planning for her all along, even though the world hadn't planned a thing. I had. She did well in school. She got a marketing degree and a job in Dallas, and she met a young man named Preston. His people had money, real money, the kind that doesn't talk about itself because it doesn't have to. His mother had a face that looked like it had never once worried about a utility bill. The first time I met them, at a steakhouse where the prices weren't printed on the menu, his father shook my hand and asked what I did. And when I said I'd worked in school cafeterias, I watched something flicker behind his eyes and then get tucked away politely. I've seen that flicker my whole life. You learn to read it. I told myself it didn't matter. Hadley was happy. She glowed when Preston looked at her. And when they got engaged, I cried real tears because all I'd ever wanted was for that girl to have the soft, easy life her mother never got. I paid for part of the wedding. I want to be honest about that because it matters to what came later. They had it at a winery outside Fredericksburg, the kind of place with string lights and a price tag that made my hands go cold when I saw it. Preston's family covered most of it naturally, but I insisted on paying for the flowers, every last bloom. It came to almost $6,000, which was more than I'd ever spent on anything in one go in my entire life, and I emptied a savings account I'd been keeping for a new roof to do it. I didn't tell Hadley that part either. I just wanted to give her something at her own wedding that was mine, something I put there. When she walked down that aisle, and the peonies were exactly the blush color she'd dreamed about since she was 12, I sat in the second row in a dress I'd bought on clearance, and I felt like the richest woman alive. That was 3 years ago. Things change slowly, the way they always do, so slow you can almost convince yourself you're imagining it. The phone calls got shorter, then they got rarer. She stopped sending pictures. When I'd call, Preston would answer sometimes and say she was swamped, and he'd have her ring me back, and she wouldn't. And a week later, she'd text something breezy like she hadn't gone dark on me at all. I told myself young marriages are busy. I told myself a lot of things. Then last spring, she called and told me she was pregnant. And for one shining minute, the old warmth came flooding back because she cried on the phone and said, "Grandma, I'm scared. I don't know how to do this." And I said the same thing I'd said over a split lip on a cracked sidewalk 30 years before. I said, "You're braver than you know, and I'll be right there." And I meant it. I started knitting that same night. a little yellow blanket because she didn't want to know if it was a boy or a girl. I knitted on that thing for months. It was the happiest I'd been since before my daughter passed. The baby shower was set for a Saturday in October at Preston's mother's house, a place out in one of those gated developments north of the city where the lawns look vacuumed. I'd already bought my plane ticket from Tulsa. I'd already wrapped the blanket in tissue paper and tucked a card inside that said things I'd never been able to say out loud. And then, 2 weeks before, Hadley asked me to come to her house alone. Just the two of us. And that's when she sat me down at that beautiful kitchen island and told me it was best if I didn't come. I asked her why. I kept my voice steady. 68 years teaches you how to keep your voice steady. She wouldn't look at me. She said the shower was going to be a certain kind of crowd. She said Preston's mother had invited her country club friends and the women from the charity board, and it was going to be really put together, and she didn't want me to feel out of place. She said it like she was protecting me. She actually used the word protecting. She said, "I don't want anyone to make you uncomfortable, Grandma." And I sat there and I understood, the way you understand a thing all at once, even though it took years to build. I wasn't being protected, I was being hidden. I thought about the cafeteria. 22 years of standing on a rubber mat serving food to other people's children so I could keep mine fed. I thought about the cameo brooch. I thought about $6,000 in peonies. And I looked at this girl I had raised, wearing a sweater that cost more than my monthly Social Security check, telling me I might embarrass her in front of women who'd never worked a hard day in their lives, and something in me went very, very quiet. I didn't argue. That's the part people don't understand. I've watched too many folks burn down a bridge they actually needed to cross. And besides, screaming has never once gotten me anything but a sore throat and the last word. I just said, "Of course, sweetheart. Whatever you need." And I drove back to the airport and I changed my flight and I went home to Tulsa and I put the yellow blanket in a drawer. But here's the thing nobody at that shower knew. Here's the thing Hadley herself had forgotten, or maybe never let herself think about. I was on the deed. Years back, when Hadley and Preston bought their first house, the one with the granite island, before they upgraded, they were short on the down payment. Preston's parents, for all their money, had some philosophy about young people earning it, and they wouldn't co-sign. So Hadley called me crying, and I did what I always do. I drove to Dallas, I sat down with their loan officer, and I put up $40,000 from the sale of the duplex I'd lived in for 30 years. The duplex where I raised her. I sold my home so she could have hers. And because I'd put in that money, my name went on the deed alongside theirs. A third owner, legally, on paper. It wasn't a loan. There was no note, no schedule. It was just me, doing what I do, and a county clerk filing it away. When they sold that first house and bought the big one in the nice school district, the proceeds rolled over, and somewhere in the paperwork idly handled, paperwork I signed wherever she pointed because I trusted her completely, my name came along for the ride. I am to this day a one-third owner of the house my granddaughter lives in. The house where she was about to host a baby shower too refined for the woman who paid for a chunk of it. I didn't know all the legal particulars at first. What I knew was a feeling in my gut, a memory of signing things. So I did something I'd never done in my life. I called a lawyer, a real one, not a TV one, a soft-spoken woman named Tilda who'd put herself through law school waiting tables and understood me before I finished my first sentence. She pulled the records, and she confirmed it. My name, right there on the deed. 33%. Mine. Now, I want to be clear about who I am, because what I did next isn't what the angry part of me wanted to do. The angry part wanted to march into that gated community and make a scene in front of the charity board. The angry part wanted to put the house on the market out of spite. I didn't do any of that. I'm not a cruel woman. But I am, after 68 years, Finally, a woman who has stopped apologizing for taking up space. So I wrote a letter, a real letter, on paper, in my own handwriting because some things shouldn't come in a text, and I had Tilda's office send it certified mail so it would arrive the morning of the shower. In it, I told Hadley the truth, all of it. The cameo brooch, the diamond studs, the roof money turned to peonies, the duplex I sold so she could have a down payment, the $40,000. And then I told her, gently but plainly, that I was a legal co-owner of the home she'd asked me not to come to, and that I'd be exercising my right as an owner to be informed of any decisions regarding the property. I wasn't threatening anything. I was just no longer pretending to be invisible. I signed it, all my love, always, your grandmother. Then I made myself a cup of coffee and I waited. I found out later exactly how the morning went because June told me. June is Preston's aunt, his late father's sister, and she is the one person in that whole shining family who ever looked me in the eye like I was a human being. She'd sat next to me at the wedding. She'd asked about my daughter and actually listened to the answer. June called me that afternoon, and I could hear from her voice she'd been crying, but they were good tears, the kind that come from watching something true finally get said out loud. She told me the letter arrived while the caterers were setting up. Preston's mother had the mail brought in on a silver tray of all things, and Hadley opened it standing in her kitchen, in her perfect dress, surrounded by perfect women, and June watched her face come apart. She read it twice. And then June said she sat down right on her own kitchen floor in that expensive dress, and she cried in a way June had never seen her cry. Preston's mother, June said, tried to smooth it over, asked what was wrong. Was it the baby? Did she need to lie down? And Hadley, my Hadley, looked up at all those women from the country club and the charity board, and she said, June told me she said it loud enough for the whole room, my grandmother sold her house so I could have mine. And I told her not to come today because I was ashamed of her. You could have heard a pin drop, June said. And then Preston's grandfather, I should say, the old patriarch himself, a man who'd never said 10 words to me. He set down his glass and he looked around that room full of his wife's polished friends, and he said, you told me her family was nothing. You told me there was no one. June said his voice shook. He'd been told all those years that Hadley came from nobody, that there was no family worth knowing. And here was proof, in a grandmother's handwriting, that the only person who'd ever truly sacrificed anything for that girl was the woman they'd been instructed to keep out of sight. My phone rang at 4 o'clock that afternoon. It was Hadley. She couldn't get a full sentence out. Grandma, she kept saying, Grandma, Grandma, like she was 9 years old again and she'd fallen off the bike. I let her cry. I didn't rush to make it okay, the way I would have my whole life. That's the part I'm proudest of, honestly. Not the letter, not the deed, but the fact that for once I let the silence sit there and do its work instead of filling it up with comfort she hadn't earned yet. When she finally got her breath, she said, why didn't you ever tell me? About the brooch? About your house? About any of it? And I told her the truth. I said, because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me. I wanted you to feel loved, free, and clear. But somewhere along the way, sweetheart, you started thinking that love that doesn't announce itself isn't worth being seen in public, and I couldn't let that be the last thing I taught you before this baby comes. She asked if she could come to Tulsa. I said yes. She drove up the next weekend, 8 months pregnant, alone, no Preston, and she sat at my little kitchen table. I rent a place now, a 1 bedroom, and it's just fine, and we talked for 6 hours. She told me things had been hard in ways she'd been too proud to share. That Preston's family made her feel like she was always one wrong fork away from being found out. That she'd started seeing me through their eyes, and she hated herself for it, and the more ashamed she got, the more she pushed me away, because I was the mirror she couldn't stand to look into. I held her hand across that table and I told her the thing I most needed her to hear. I said, I'm not on that deed to hold anything over you. I'll sign my third right over to you and the baby tomorrow if you want it, free and clear, and never say another word." Her eyes went wide, and I said, "But I'm only going to do it once you understand why I never had to. You don't keep people who love you because they've got leverage. You keep them because you finally figured out what they're worth." She named the baby after my daughter, her mother. A little girl born just before Christmas with a full head of dark hair and a grip like she meant to hold on to this world. They drove down from Dallas and put her in my arms in the hospital, and Preston, who is, I'll admit, trying harder than I expected, stood at the foot of the bed and said, quietly, "Thank you for everything you did. I didn't know. I believe he didn't. He'd been fed the same story everyone in that family had been fed." I gave Hadley the yellow blanket, the one I'd put away in a drawer the day I changed my flight. It was a little dusty at the folds. She pressed it to her face and breathed it in and started crying all over again. I never did sign over my third of the house, not out of spite, out of something she finally understood. She told me to keep it. She said she sleeps better knowing her grandmother's name is on the same walls that keep her daughter safe at night. She said it's the truest thing in that whole expensive neighborhood. I'm 70 now. I babysit twice a week. The country club friends, I'm told, still ask about me. The grandmother who turned out to be somebody after all. Preston's grandfather sends me a card every birthday now, in his shaky handwriting, always the same line, "Glad we know the truth." His wife and I will never be close, and that's all right. I stopped needing the approval of people who measure worth in the wrong currency a long time ago. There's a picture on my refrigerator. It's Hadley in the hospital holding the baby, and the yellow blanket is tucked around them both. And every time I look at it, I think about that morning at the kitchen island, the smile I gave her, the "of course, sweetheart." People hear this story and they think the lesson is about the deed, about money, about the satisfying turn when the truth landed on a silver tray in front of all those women. But that's not it. The lesson is that love, which has to stay hidden to be tolerated, isn't love at all. It's shame wearing love's coat. I let myself be hidden for 3 years because I thought that's what a good grandmother does, swallows her pride so the child can shine. I was wrong. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone you raised is to finally, quietly refuse to disappear. She calls me every Sunday now. She always has ever since. And every single time before she hangs up, she says, "I'm so glad you came, Grandma, not to the shower, to all of it, to her whole life." And I tell her the truth, which is that I never once left. I've thought a lot about that morning at the kitchen island, the smile I gave Hadley when she asked me to stay away. For years, I believed that swallowing my own pride was the highest form of love a grandmother could offer. I was wrong, and it took almost losing her to see it. Everything that happened, the silver tray, the letter, the room going quiet, none of it was luck. It was the long arithmetic of choices finally coming due. Hadley pushed me away because she'd learned slowly that love which stays quiet must not be worth much. And she'd learned that partly from me, because I'd spent 30 years hiding every sacrifice I made for her, thinking I was protecting her from the weight of it. We both reaped what we'd quietly planted. What pulled us back from the edge wasn't anger. If I'd marched into that gated neighborhood and made a scene, I'd have proved every ugly thing they believed about where she came from. Doing the right thing, even when the wrong thing would have felt so much better, is what gave the truth room to land on its own. I wrote a letter instead of a tantrum. That was the first thing. The second thing was knowing the difference between being a doormat and being patient. For most of my life, I confused the two. I let people walk past me because I thought disappearing was the same as being good. But there's a kind of clear-eyed wisdom in knowing exactly when to stop apologizing for taking up space, in seeing that I'd been the legal owner of that house all along, and that the truth was already mine to tell, no scene required. I didn't need leverage. I needed clarity. Once I had it, I used it gently, and gentleness with the truth behind it turned out to be stronger than any shouting match. And the third thing was simply not quitting on her. It would have been easier to let the silence become permanent. Plenty of people would have. But I'd buried my own daughter, and I'd made her a promise, and you don't get to set a promise down just because keeping it hurts. The strength it took to wait by the phone, to let Hadley cry without rushing to fix it, to hold a line I'd never held in my life, that came from somewhere old in me, somewhere that had survived a husband who left and a daughter who died, and 1,000 smaller losses in between. If you take anything from my story, let it be this: be good even when no one is watching and no one will thank you. Be wise enough to know when your kindness is being mistaken for invisibility, and be strong enough to stay quietly until the people you love finally understand what staying cost you. Hadley named her daughter after my girl. That's not a reward I earned. It's just what happens when you keep showing up long after the world tells you to disappear.